The phone call came on a gray morning, the kind that seemed to have no beginning and no end. It was Olivia, the eldest granddaughter, who received it first. Her heart sank as she listened to the voice on the other end, a voice she hadn't heard in years, offering condolences for her grandmother's sudden passing. Grandma Evelyn had always been a force in their lives, but not in a way they appreciated. She had raised them in the background, quietly loving them while they'd been consumed with their own lives. For years, she had been ignored, dismissed, and occasionally patronized by the family. Her sharp tongue and difficult nature were the excuses they clung to. Olivia's thoughts flashed back to those times she'd rolled her eyes at her grandmother's stories about her past, the countless moments when Grandma had tried to offer advice or wisdom, only to be met with indifference. Now, Grandma Evelyn was gone. The family gathered quickly for the funeral, drawn more by a sense of obligation than grief. The house, once full of Grandma's old-fashioned trinkets and shelves lined with dusty books, felt cold and foreign without her presence. The air seemed to hum with unspoken tension as relatives who hadn't seen each other in years exchanged uncomfortable glances. There was Richard, the uncle who'd built his life on business success and had never once visited Grandma unless it was to ask for a favor. Margaret, the aunt who'd been estranged from the family for years, appeared at the back of the room, her face drawn but stoic. Then there was the younger generation, Olivia's cousins, who had once been close but had grown apart over time, each nursing their own disappointments with family dynamics. The eulogies were short, perfunctory. No one spoke of Grandma's spirit, her kindness, or the way she had quietly shaped their lives. Instead, they glossed over the discomfort that had always existed between her and the family. Olivia stood, lost in thought, unable to process the absence of someone she'd never truly understood. The lawyer's office was where the real shock would occur. Once the funeral was over, the family gathered in the sterile, dimly lit office, expecting the reading of the will to be a simple affair. Grandma's wealth had always been a topic of whispered speculation. Her house, her assets, her antiques. But no one had thought much of it. Surely it was going to be divided evenly, or maybe left to Olivia as the only grandchild who had maintained any semblance of a relationship with her. But when the lawyer began to read, it quickly became clear that this would be no ordinary inheritance. Grandma had left behind something far more complex than a list of beneficiaries. Her will was a puzzle, a map leading them through a series of cryptic tasks. The first line of the will: "To those who think they know me, I leave the journey of a lifetime. Only those who seek the truth will understand my gift," shocked the family into silence. What followed were a series of instructions, each one more bizarre than the last, each more difficult than the last. Tasks that seemed trivial on the surface, but upon closer inspection, revealed themselves to be riddles, challenges that tested not only their intelligence, but their moral fiber. And the most striking revelation: there was no mention of a traditional inheritance at all. Instead, Grandma's fortune would only be theirs if they completed these challenges, tasks that would force them to confront their darkest secrets and deepest regrets. The first clue, typed in the familiar old font on the will's parchment, seemed almost mocking in its simplicity. The key to everything lies where the past was buried. Whispers filled the room. What was Grandma's intention? Was this a final act of revenge for all the years she had been dismissed? Or was it an attempt to make them confront something more profound about themselves? The family exchanged glances. Some angered, others intrigued. The wealth had always been a distant concept to them, but now they realized that what they thought was a simple inheritance was actually the beginning of a much darker journey, one they would have no choice but to follow. And so, the first chapter of this twisted legacy began. With Grandma's death, a chain of events had been set into motion, one that would unravel the very fabric of their family's relationships and challenge everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and betrayal. The air in the lawyer's office was thick with disbelief. Grandma's final words had left everyone stunned, but it wasn't just the cryptic nature of the will that shook them, it was the realization that nothing was going to be straightforward. The inheritance wasn't a matter of simply opening an envelope and divvying up her assets. It was a journey, a test. Olivia's fingers tightened around the edge of the table as the lawyer continued reading aloud, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of disbelief. Grandma had always been unpredictable, but no one had ever imagined she'd go to such lengths in death to make her family earn their inheritance. The family was caught in a web of confusion and curiosity, each of them wondering if they were really prepared for what was to come. The first clue sat there on the paper before them, looking innocent enough. The key to everything lies where the past was buried. It wasn't just a riddle, it was a command. The family members exchanged nervous glances. What did it mean? Where was the past buried? Was it a literal location, or was it metaphorical? Margaret, the aunt who had distanced herself from the family for so long, was the first to speak. "She's playing games with us." "She always did love puzzles," she muttered, her voice tinged with both exasperation and amusement. But as she looked around at the others, she saw the uncertainty in their eyes. No one else was laughing. Richard, the self-assured and successful businessman, leaned forward in his chair, his face hardening with the weight of the challenge. He was used to having control, to getting what he wanted without complication. Now, for the first time, he was at a loss. "We'll need to take this seriously," he said, his voice tight. "She's not leaving us a choice." The lawyer, who had been instructed to act as both guide and neutral party, cleared his throat. "The will is clear. You must complete these tasks in order. Each challenge will bring you closer to understanding your inheritance, and to each other." A heavy silence settled over the room. It wasn't just the inheritance that hung in the balance. It was their futures, their family legacy, and perhaps their very identities. "Where do we start?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to bridge gaps between family members, but this time, even she was struggling to find a way forward. "The first task," the lawyer said, "is clear. It's tied to your grandmother's history. The clue mentions where the past was buried. The location is something only those who truly knew her could understand." Olivia stood, her mind racing. What did Grandma mean by the past? Was it something hidden? A place they'd all forgotten about? Or was it a memory, an event that had been swept under the rug for years? Olivia's thoughts began to spiral, but she forced herself to stay focused. She had always been the one to see things through to the end, even if it meant facing painful truths. Aunt Margaret, who had always been the more cynical one, spoke up again. "We need to go through her things, find something, anything that gives us a hint." Richard, however, seemed less enthusiastic. "This is ridiculous. We're not here to play games. We're here for the money. Let's just find the cash, split it, and be done with it." But Olivia wasn't so sure. The more she thought about it, the more the idea of uncovering the truth became personal. Grandma had always been more than just a family matriarch. She had been a woman of secrets. Olivia's curiosity, once buried under years of indifference, was now bubbling to the surface. What had she missed all these years? As the family members filed out of the lawyer's office, the weight of the task ahead settled over them. The clue had sparked something inside each of them. Some saw it as an obstacle, others as a game to win. But Olivia felt a different pull, one that made her think that perhaps the true inheritance wasn't in the fortune at all. Maybe Grandma's will wasn't about money. Maybe it was about the truth, the buried past, and what they would all be forced to face in the coming days. As they left the office, the first step of the puzzle already in motion, one thing became clear. They were no longer a family bound by shared history and love. They were strangers, each of them desperate to uncover their own truths, each willing to risk everything to uncover what Grandma had hidden. And so, the first clue beckoned them toward a journey that would unravel their past and their futures. The first clue was more than just a riddle. It was a door. A door that opened into a shadowy part of the past that none of them were truly ready to face. As the family gathered again, this time at Grandma's old house, a place they had all come to regard as merely a relic of the past, the air was thick, with both dread and anticipation. The house was exactly as it had always been. Dark wood paneling, antique furniture covered in dusty sheets, and the faint smell of mothballs lingering in the corners. Olivia could still remember the way Grandma would sit in the armchair by the window, knitting quietly, her sharp eyes watching over everyone with a knowing gaze. There had always been an air of mystery about her, a sense that she was somehow more than she appeared. But no one had ever bothered to ask, to dig deeper. Until now. The family split up to search the house, each person hoping to be the one to find the next clue. Olivia found herself wandering through the hallway, her fingers brushing the framed photographs lining the walls. The images showed her grandparents in younger days, smiling at family gatherings, at holidays, at birthdays. But something about the photos felt off. They were happy, but not quite genuine. She stopped at one photo in particular. Grandma and Grandpa, sitting on a bench in what appeared to be a park. Grandma had an arm draped around a man who wasn't Grandpa, his face hidden in the shadows. Olivia's stomach churned. Could it be? Had Grandma been hiding something all these years? Elsewhere in the house, Richard, unable to sit still, was rifling through drawers in the study. He was desperate to find something tangible, something that could give him the upper hand. As he flipped through an old ledger, a yellowed envelope fell to the floor. He picked it up, heart racing. Inside was a letter, written in Grandma's distinctive handwriting. His eyes scanned the words. I know what I did was wrong, but there's no going back now. You will never understand, but I hope one day you will forgive me. Richard's breath caught in his throat. What was this? Who was Grandma writing to? His mind raced with possibilities. Betrayals, secrets long buried. It wasn't the fortune he had been after that had his attention now, but this unexpected glimpse into Grandma's past. Meanwhile, Aunt Margaret was deep in the attic, carefully moving old boxes out of the way. She had always hated this house. The memories of her childhood here were filled with bitterness and resentment. Grandma had been cold and distant, offering little affection, never quite showing the warmth Margaret had craved. She opened a dusty trunk and began sifting through old clothes, feeling the sting of lost time and love. Then, buried beneath some faded blankets, she found something unexpected. A small wooden box, intricately carved with patterns that looked like they belonged in another era. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the box. Inside, there was a stack of old letters tied with a red ribbon. As she read the first letter, her heart pounded. It was addressed to Grandma, but it was from a man named Thomas. The letter spoke of a passionate affair that had lasted for years, an affair that had been kept secret from everyone, including Grandpa. The letters painted a picture of a woman who had been deeply in love, but who had made a choice that would haunt her forever. Margaret's fingers trembled as she realized Grandma had loved someone else, someone who wasn't her grandfather. The revelation rocked her to her core. Could this be what the will was pointing to? The past that had been buried for so long? But Margaret's confusion soon gave way to anger. All these years she had felt abandoned by Grandma's coldness, but now she realized it was something far deeper, a painful secret that had shaped everything. The distance, the lack of affection, it was all part of a past that no one had ever known. Back in the living room, Olivia continued to feel the weight of the photo she had discovered earlier. She couldn't stop thinking about the man beside Grandma. Who was he? What was his connection to Grandma? And why had she kept it hidden? Was this the key to the first clue? The buried past? As the family reconvened in the center of the house, their faces were pale with shock. Each had come across something different, yet the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align. Grandma's secrets were not just a matter of hidden relationships. They were a part of a larger story, one that had been intentionally erased from their memories. Richard, his hands still shaking from the letter he had found, broke the silence. She had an affair. And it wasn't just any affair. This Thomas guy, he meant something to her. Something we never knew. Olivia's eyes widened. But who was he? And why didn't we ever hear about him? I don't know, Richard said, his voice strained. But I think this is what she meant. This is where the past was buried. Her secrets, her regrets. Everything we thought we knew about her is a lie. Aunt Margaret, still holding the letters, nodded slowly. I never wanted to believe it. But now I don't think we ever truly knew her. Not the way we thought. As the revelations unfolded, one thing became clear. The family was no longer just searching for an inheritance. They were unearthing a buried history, one that had been deliberately hidden from them, and with every secret they uncovered, the stakes grew higher. The truth was out there, waiting to be fully exposed, but the deeper they dug, the more it seemed like Grandma's past was intertwined with their own, with each of their lives in ways they hadn't anticipated. The past wasn't buried in some forgotten corner of the house. It was buried in each of them, in the choices they had made, in the lies they had told, and in the deep wounds that had never been healed. And with every step closer they got to uncovering the truth, they couldn't help but wonder, was the inheritance worth all of this? Or was Grandma's true gift something else entirely? As the search for the next clue deepened, so did the cracks in the family's facade. What had begun as a collective attempt to honor Grandma's will had turned into a vicious battle for power, secrets, and survival. The family, once bound by shared blood and memories, now found themselves on opposite sides, forming uneasy alliances while quietly plotting behind one another's backs. The atmosphere in Grandma's house was thick with suspicion, the walls themselves seeming to whisper the lies and betrayals that had been buried for decades. What had once felt like a family reunion now resembled a high-stakes game of chess, where each move could either bring them closer to the inheritance or expose a devastating secret that would tear them apart forever. Richard, always the strategist, quickly recognized that the will was more than just a puzzle to be solved. It was a test of character. The first few challenges had exposed cracks in the family's relationships, but Richard, ever the opportunist, saw the potential for greater control. He began to rally the others, speaking to them in hushed tones, suggesting that they form an alliance to tackle the tasks together. His charm and business acumen made him a natural leader, and his offer to protect the interests of the weaker family members seemed generous. But behind his smooth words lay a hidden agenda. He was plotting to take the inheritance for himself. He wasn't interested in solving Grandma's riddles for the sake of the family. He wanted the fortune, and he would do anything to get it. Olivia, though still struggling to process the revelations about Grandma's past, couldn't ignore the shift that had occurred in her family. She had always tried to be the peacemaker, the one who mended fences, but she could feel the tension building between them all. Richard's growing influence was impossible to ignore, and she was beginning to question his true motives. Was he really trying to bring the family together, or was he just using them as pawns in his own game? Margaret, however, was less easily swayed. Having uncovered her own bombshell about Grandma's affair, she felt the sting of betrayal deeper than most. Her bitterness towards Grandma had already been well established, but now her feelings were mixed with a growing suspicion that Grandma's will had been designed to destroy the family from within. She wanted this, Margaret muttered to herself one night, pacing the dimly lit kitchen. She wanted us to tear each other apart. Aunt Margaret, who had always been the rebel of the family, couldn't bear the thought of letting Richard take control. He was too smooth, too self-assured, and she had long suspected he'd never cared for the family in any real sense. In a moment of quiet rebellion, she reached out to the cousins, Jack and Hannah, who had become disillusioned with Richard's manipulation. They, too, had their own grievances with him, as he had always belittled their contributions and dismissed their efforts. Together, the three of them began to form their own alliance, one that was centered on exposing Richard for the manipulative person he truly was. Meanwhile, Jack, the youngest cousin, felt himself torn between the factions. He had always been the outlier in the family, the one who hadn't been around much and wasn't as emotionally invested in the drama. But as he became more involved in the challenges, he realized he had his own skeletons to confront. The more he saw of Richard's growing influence, the more he felt a strange kinship with him. There was something magnetic about Richard's confidence, and Jack found himself questioning the motives of the others. Was he really making an alliance with the right people, or was he being used just like everyone else? Hannah, on the other hand, was struggling with her own turmoil. She had always been the quiet one, the observer, but the will had awakened something in her. The more she discovered about Grandma's hidden life, the more she realized that her own family was built on lies and deceit. She could no longer sit on the sidelines. As Richard's influence grew stronger, so did her anger towards him and towards the rest of the family for their indifference to Grandma's suffering. She had always looked up to Richard as the successful, charismatic uncle, but now she began to see him for what he truly was, a man who cared for no one but himself. She didn't want to join any side just for the sake of it, but the pressure was mounting, and it felt like she was being forced to choose. The atmosphere in the house became increasingly charged, each person on edge, their nerves frayed. Trust was a fragile thing now, easily broken with a glance, a word, or an action that could be misinterpreted. There were whispered arguments in the corners, moments of quiet tension that escalated into loud confrontations. The deeper the family delved into Grandma's past, the more they realized that they were not just fighting for money. They were fighting for their own identities, their legacies, and their place within the fractured family dynamic. One night, during a particularly heated argument in the living room, Olivia found herself standing between two opposing sides, Richard and Margaret, both of them shouting accusations and insults. She was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained. The rift between them was widening by the second, and she could feel the weight of the family's collective anger pressing down on her. She had tried to hold everything together, but now it seemed like there was no way to stop the destruction. As the chaos continued to swirl around her, Olivia's thoughts returned to Grandma's will. Was this what Grandma had wanted? Had she known that the inheritance would create such a divide? Or had she been so consumed by her own pain and regrets that she had set the family on a course toward self-destruction? With each passing day, it became clearer that Grandma's will wasn't just about money, it was about forcing the family to confront their darkest truths, their betrayals, their alliances, and their fractured bonds. And as the battles grew fiercer, one thing was certain: not everyone would come out of this unscathed. The house had become a battleground. Every inch of it felt soaked in tension, secrets, and the haunting legacy of a woman who had lived in silence for far too long. The family was unraveling, torn apart by the revelations they had uncovered so far, and yet they couldn't stop digging. Each new clue led them deeper into a maze of lies, betrayal, and pain. It was Olivia, perhaps because of her quiet observance, who stumbled upon the journal. She had spent the morning in the attic, where old family heirlooms were stacked in dusty corners. The attic was dark and musty, filled with forgotten relics of the past, but it was also oddly peaceful, a place where she could think without the tension of the family's constant squabbles. She was searching for something, anything, that could shed more light on Grandma's past. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find. Perhaps a letter, a photograph, or a keepsake that could provide more context to the family's tangled history. And then, hidden behind a pile of old magazines and yellowed newspapers, she saw it. A small, leather-bound book, worn and weathered with age. It was inconspicuous at first glance, nothing special, but there was something about the way it seemed to call out to her. As she opened it, she felt the weight of it, the heaviness of secrets that had been locked away for decades. The journal was Grandma's, there was no doubt about it. Her handwriting filled the pages, neat, precise, but each word seemed to carry a weight of sorrow. Olivia's fingers trembled as she began to read, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The first entry was dated years before Olivia was born, when Grandma was still young, full of life, and living in a world that seemed so distant now. The early pages were filled with mundane details: what she'd had for dinner, the weather, the errands she'd run. But then, as Olivia flipped through the pages, the entries grew darker, more personal. "I don't know what to do. The pain is too much. It's not just the silence from your father. It's everything. I feel invisible, as though no one sees me. Not truly." Olivia paused, reading the words again. It was clear now that Grandma hadn't been the strong, indomitable woman the family had always believed her to be. She had been lonely, hurt, neglected. The entry went on to describe how Grandma felt increasingly isolated, not just from her husband, but from her children as well. It wasn't just neglect. It was as if she had been erased from the family's narrative, a forgotten figure in a story no one cared to tell. As Olivia read further, she found something that made her blood run cold. There, in black ink on the page, was a confession. "I had to leave. I had to. He never loved me the way I needed, and I couldn't stand the emptiness anymore. I don't know if I can ever come back." A chill swept through Olivia's body. She was sure now that Grandma's disappearance for nearly a decade wasn't a mystery. It was a choice. She had walked away from the family, leaving behind everyone she had loved, in search of something more, something she could never find within the confines of her role as a mother and wife. But it wasn't just the disappearance that unsettled Olivia. It was the hint of something darker, something that had never been spoken of aloud. The next few pages contained more cryptic entries, vague references to affairs, betrayal, and a sense of desperation. Olivia's mind raced as she tried to piece it all together. Grandma had kept secrets, secrets that, it seemed, had never been meant for anyone's eyes. But it wasn't until she reached the final pages that Olivia found the most damning revelation. Grandma had written about someone who wasn't her husband, someone who had been part of her life in a way no one had ever suspected. There was a name, Thomas. The very same name from the letters Margaret had found earlier. Olivia felt the weight of it settle on her chest. The affair wasn't just a passing fling, it was something deep, something that had lasted for years. The entries about Thomas were filled with passion, regret, and a desperate longing for a life that could never be. Olivia read with mounting horror as Grandma described how her affair with Thomas had been a way for her to feel alive again, to feel loved in a way that no one else had ever made her feel. But the relationship had been more than just a betrayal. It had been a turning point in Grandma's life, leading her down a path of self-destruction. The journal's final entry read, "I don't know how much longer I can keep up the charade. I have broken too many promises, hurt too many people. But I can't stop. I can't turn back now. The life I want doesn't exist in the world I've built. And yet, I can't leave. Not yet." Olivia closed the journal slowly, her breath shaky. The weight of the revelation pressed on her chest, and for a moment, it was hard to breathe. Grandma hadn't just been a victim of neglect. She had been a woman who had made choices that hurt those closest to her. And as much as Olivia felt sympathy for the pain Grandma had endured, she couldn't ignore the fact that Grandma had caused pain as well. But there was still more. As Olivia sifted through the journal, she came across a folded letter tucked between 2 pages. It was addressed to Olivia, but it was clearly written long before her birth. With trembling hands, Olivia opened it. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, know that I love you. I've made mistakes and I've hurt people. But the greatest mistake I made was in not being the grandmother you needed. I hope you can forgive me, and I hope that you will understand one day why I did what I did. The truth is the hardest thing to face, but sometimes it's the only thing that can set us free." Olivia's eyes filled with tears. It was as if Grandma had known, had seen the future in which Olivia would be forced to uncover the truth, to face the dark side of their family's history. But the letter also held a glimmer of something else, a final hope that, despite everything, Olivia would find peace with the past, just as Grandma had never been able to. As Olivia sat alone in the attic, the weight of Grandma's words settled around her like a shroud. She had always thought she knew her grandmother, but now, with the journal in her hands, everything had changed. The secrets Grandma had kept hidden for so long were now out in the open, and they would change the course of the family's future forever. But what was Grandma's real intention in leaving behind this journal? Was it an apology, a confession? Or was it a final attempt to guide her family toward redemption, to make them see that the true inheritance wasn't money? It was the truth that had been buried beneath years of silence. The mood in the house had shifted again, this time from cautious curiosity to a more frantic urgency. The discovery of Grandma's journal and the unraveling of her hidden past had already shaken the family to their core, but they couldn't afford to dwell on the emotional fallout. The will had given them no time to process their grief. It was a ticking clock, each new challenge pushing them further down a path they weren't sure they could return from. When the next clue arrived, it was unlike anything they had expected. It wasn't a riddle, nor a cryptic note hidden in the pages of an old book. Instead, it arrived with an ominous simplicity. An envelope placed on the kitchen table. It had no return address, only Grandma's signature, familiar, yet cold. Inside, there was a single piece of paper. On it, a set of instructions. "The first challenge awaits you, but remember, there are no rules but one. Do not falter. The consequences will be grave." Olivia's fingers shook as she read the words aloud. The room fell silent, the weight of them sinking in. They weren't just clues anymore. They were warnings. And whatever was coming next, it was going to be far worse than anything they had faced before. The first challenge was set in motion quickly, with Grandma's instructions revealing little about what was to come. A location was provided, an old abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. The family was to meet there at midnight, and the challenge would be revealed upon arrival. No one was to arrive early, and no one was allowed to leave until the task was completed. The rules, such as they were, felt more like a trap. As the hours ticked by, the family members couldn't hide their growing anxiety. Richard, ever the strategist, insisted that they stick together, forming a tight-knit group that would stick to the plan. Olivia, however, felt a gnawing suspicion in the pit of her stomach. She was beginning to understand that Grandma's will wasn't just about inheritance. It was about forcing them to confront things they weren't ready to face. And as they prepared to leave for the barn, the looming dread of what awaited them was palpable. The barn was exactly as they had expected, dilapidated, dark, and foreboding. The rusted hinges creaked as they pushed the doors open, revealing an eerie emptiness. There was no sign of anyone else, no staff waiting to guide them, no cameras recording their every move, just the thick, stale air and the scent of old hay and wood. The family gathered inside, standing in a loose circle, the cold biting at their skin. The walls felt as if they were closing in on them, the silence stretching longer than it should. It was then that they heard it, the unmistakable sound of a bell ringing from the rafters above. A figure stepped forward from the shadows and everyone gasped. It was a woman, tall, with piercing eyes and a presence that was hard to ignore. Her hair was silver, pulled back tightly into a bun. She was dressed in a long, flowing black dress, and her features were sharp, almost otherworldly. For a brief, surreal moment, Olivia thought she was looking at Grandma herself. Older, perhaps, but unmistakably her. "This is the first challenge," the woman said, her voice echoing in the barn's high ceilings. "You must play the game as it was meant to be played. Each of you will have a role to fulfill. Fail, and the consequences will be severe." Olivia glanced nervously at her relatives. Richard's confident facade had slipped. He looked just as unsettled as the rest of them. Margaret folded her arms across her chest, her face a mixture of skepticism and defiance. The woman stepped aside, revealing a long wooden table that had been set up in the middle of the barn. On it lay several items, odd, eclectic objects that none of them could immediately identify. At one end of the table was a bowl of what appeared to be a thick, dark liquid, steaming slightly in the cold air. "You will be divided into teams," the woman continued, "and you will compete in a series of physical and mental tasks. The first team to complete the challenge will move on to the next phase. The others will fail." The word fail lingered in the air like a death sentence. The woman then began to explain the rules in greater detail. The game would test both their physical endurance and their ability to work together. It was more than just a puzzle. It was a battle of wits, stamina, and resilience. Some tasks would require them to dig deep within themselves, pushing their limits. Others would force them to confront their greatest fears, fears they had long buried or perhaps never known they had. The first challenge was a test of trust. One person from each team would be blindfolded and led to a point far across the barn. They would then have to navigate an obstacle course, one that seemed simple at first glance but was far more dangerous than it appeared. Sharp objects, hidden traps, and deceptive paths littered the way. The rest of the team could only guide them with their voices, but no one could step foot on the course to help. It was all about trust, and if they failed to guide their team member correctly, they would lose. Richard, ever the leader, immediately volunteered to be the first blindfolded. He believed that his ability to strategize would allow him to succeed where others might falter. But as he took the first step, a sudden noise broke the silence. A loud, jarring crash from the far side of the barn. The team froze, unsure of what to do next. "Keep moving," the woman's voice called out, as cold and emotionless as ever. "The challenge has already begun." Richard swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He couldn't see a thing, and his every sense seemed amplified. The creaking of the barn, the smell of damp hay, the soft rustling of his teammates behind him. He hesitated, uncertain, and when he made his first step forward, he stumbled over something sharp, grazing his arm and causing him to curse in pain. The tension in the barn was palpable. Every decision felt like a gamble, each step a risk. But the stakes were higher than they had anticipated. What started as a game quickly became a fight for survival. The family could no longer rely on the usual tactics they had used to manipulate or control one another. In this twisted game, they were forced to rely on each other in ways they had never done before. The first task ended in disaster. Richard failed to navigate the course correctly, and his misstep caused the team to lose. The woman's cold gaze swept over him, her lips curling into a smile that was anything but comforting. "Failure," she said simply. "The price will be paid." As the family members stood there in stunned silence, they realized the true gravity of the game they were now caught up in. It wasn't just about winning a fortune, it was about survival. And they were about to face far worse challenges before this journey was over. The fallout from the first challenge lingered like a thick fog over the family. Richard nursed the gash on his arm in silence, while the others sat in scattered silence throughout Grandma's now haunted house. Everyone was exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. But the game wasn't over. If anything, it was only beginning to twist into something even more unsettling. It was in this vulnerable space, frayed nerves and exposed wounds, that emotions began to flare. For a family so tightly wound in secrets and competition, vulnerability was dangerous. That night, Olivia slipped into the old greenhouse out back, a place where Grandma once spent her quiet afternoons. The air inside was heavy with the scent of earth and roses, though many of the flowers had long withered. She wasn't alone. Across the dusty space stood Jonah, her cousin by law, but closer than a cousin had any right to be. He was married to her father's niece, but their relationship had always existed in the gray shadows, an unspoken connection that hovered just outside the lines of propriety. Jonah stepped forward, his eyes shadowed with both regret and longing. "Do you remember what Grandma once said?" he asked softly. "Nothing buried ever stays that way." Olivia turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "That woman always knew more than she let on." Their fingers brushed, then lingered. A kiss followed, one that wasn't born of passion but desperation, of needing something human in the middle of the chaos. But what they didn't realize was that they weren't alone. In the hallway just outside the greenhouse, Margaret stood frozen, having seen everything through the cracked glass door. Her expression wasn't one of shock, it was satisfaction. She had suspected something between them for years, and now finally she had proof she could use. Elsewhere in the house, other shadows stirred. Marcus, Grandma's reclusive great-nephew, had been watching from the sidelines for too long. With the revelation of the journal and the previous challenges, he had grown more withdrawn, yet more observant. He had seen what no one else had, the growing closeness between Olivia and Jonah, the sidelong glances, the tension. And he wasn't the only one. As the family gathered the next morning to decipher the new clue, a vintage love letter hidden in a music box, it became clear that this challenge wasn't about riddles or mazes. It was emotional warfare. The letter was addressed to Evelyn, but it wasn't signed by Grandpa George. "Who's Daniel?" Olivia asked aloud, her voice echoing through the room. The silence that followed was heavy. No one spoke, no one needed to. Grandma had been in love with someone else, a man named Daniel. The implications hit hard. George had died decades ago, revered and honored. But this revelation threatened to rewrite everything they thought they knew about their family's foundation. As Margaret quietly folded the letter and tucked it into her coat pocket, she turned to Olivia with a venomous smile. "Looks like you're not the only one with a dirty little secret." The house turned into a pressure cooker. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. Who was Daniel? Was he still alive? Was he the real reason Grandma disappeared for 10 years? And if so, who in the family had helped keep that secret? That night, another confrontation erupted, this time between Jonah and his wife, Emily. She had suspected the affair long before she saw the signs. But now, with confirmation and the entire family watching, she lost all pretense of control. "You think you're the only one Grandma was trying to expose?" she hissed, pointing a trembling finger. "Maybe this whole thing isn't about forgiveness. Maybe it's about humiliation." But perhaps the most gutting revelation came from an unexpected place. A hidden letter, dated 25 years ago, written by Grandma to her eldest daughter Penelope. The letter was part confession, part warning. If you're reading this, it means you've chosen to continue the cycle. But remember, what we hide festers. What we protect weakens. Love, when buried under lies, turns to poison. And you, my dear, have secrets far darker than mine. The letter was signed in red ink, Grandma's signature unmistakable. The red ink was symbolic now, like blood. Penelope collapsed into a chair, face pale, as her daughter demanded answers. But Penelope offered none. Only a steely silence that made it clear the sins of the past were not yet fully unearthed. Love had existed in this family once, but it had been twisted by lies, buried under betrayals, and weaponized in revenge. And Grandma, even in death, was dragging every secret into the light, one painful layer at a time. Just when the fractures in the family seemed beyond repair, the doorbell rang. It was early morning, too early for visitors, and most of the family was still asleep or licking wounds from the emotional warfare of the previous night. Olivia was the one who opened the door, still bleary-eyed from a restless sleep. Standing on the porch was a stranger, tall, dressed in a dark overcoat, with a calm yet intense demeanor. His eyes were piercing, almost too familiar. "I'm looking for the Lennox family," he said. "What's left of them," Olivia replied cautiously. "Who are you?" He hesitated, then held up a worn, leather-bound letter. The envelope was sealed with the same ornate crest Grandma used for her personal correspondence, a lily and a serpent intertwined. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "I'm her son," he said. "Her first son. My name is Elias." The house turned to ice. In the living room, the family gathered in stunned silence as Elias introduced himself. He was older than most of the cousins, but younger than Penelope and Richard. His presence was quiet, watchful. Every word he spoke seemed deliberately chosen. And he brought proof, photographs of himself as a child with Grandma during her years of absence, love letters between her and Daniel, the man mentioned in the vintage letter from the previous chapter, and, most damning of all, a signed amendment to the will. "She kept me a secret," Elias admitted, scanning the faces in the room. "Not because she was ashamed of me, but because she was ashamed of you. She said the family had become something poisonous. She wanted me to stay free of it, but before she died, she asked me to come. She said the inheritance couldn't be complete without all her children." The backlash was immediate. Penelope was the first to speak, her voice shaking with rage. "This is a setup. He's not part of this family," Richard scoffed. "How convenient. A long-lost brother shows up just in time to steal the prize." But Olivia, still holding the letter Elias had handed her, felt something different. The seal on the envelope matched the ones from previous challenges, and inside was the next clue, clearly meant for him. Elias, it turned out, was no ordinary outsider. Grandma had involved him in her preparations for the challenge. He had been living under a pseudonym, communicating with her through coded letters for years. She had trained him, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, for this role. The next task was more than a test, it was a reckoning. With Elias now part of the team, he held critical knowledge none of them had, a cipher key that could decode the final part of Grandma's journal. The pages had been unreadable until now, written in an obscure symbol language based on the flowers Grandma grew in her greenhouse, each symbol representing a flower, each flower a message. It was only Elias who knew the code. The decoded entries revealed a shocking truth. Grandma had known about the betrayal years ago, the one that resulted in her financial ruin and 10-year disappearance. She had narrowed the culprit down to 2 people in the family, but had never confirmed which. That secret, she wrote, would be revealed in the final challenge. But Elias's arrival stirred more than suspicion. He had a presence that unsettled people, not aggressive, but unnervingly perceptive. He asked questions others avoided. He noticed silences, absences, and his calm demeanor unnerved Richard and Penelope the most. Meanwhile, Olivia found herself drawn to Elias, not romantically, but intellectually. His arrival offered perspective. He wasn't clouded by years of grudges and traditions. He asked the questions she was too afraid to voice. What if the fortune isn't the point? What if Grandma was preparing them for something darker? Over the next few days, as tensions boiled and old alliances shattered, Elias began to shift the balance. He wasn't just a wild card, he was becoming a leader. Some began turning to him for guidance, believing that Grandma's true heir was the one she trusted enough to keep in the shadows. But not everyone saw Elias as a savior. Margaret was convinced he had a hidden agenda. Emily began sneaking off to make calls to a mysterious contact, trying to dig into Elias's background. Even Marcus, the quiet observer, seemed increasingly disturbed, his journal now filled with drawings of Elias surrounded by flames. Then came a final twist. While exploring the greenhouse again, Olivia discovered a hidden panel beneath one of the stone benches. Inside was a lockbox, and inside that, a second will. This version of the will was handwritten, much older, and it named Elias as the sole inheritor, bypassing the rest of the family entirely. The room went nuclear. Elias claimed he hadn't known. Olivia believed him. The others didn't. Now the family was forced to make a choice: accept Elias as the legitimate heir and risk losing everything, or continue the challenge and take the final step into the unknown. But as Grandma's words echoed again, only one can win but all must change, they realized something darker was approaching. Because Elias had brought more than knowledge. He had brought a truth no one was ready to face. The house was no longer just Grandma's. It had become a battleground of secrets, betrayals, and revelations. The air was thick with distrust. Elias's arrival had shattered what little cohesion remained. The family split into uneasy factions, some supporting the mysterious new heir, others convinced he was a con artist manipulating Grandma's memory for gain. But all sides were forced to come together when the final envelope arrived. It was delivered in the most chilling way yet, slipped under the dining room door in the dead of night, sealed with the same serpent lily emblem, but this time in black wax. Inside was no riddle, no journal entry, no playful metaphor. It was a choice. Two options, one decision. Option 1, walk away now. Accept your share of Grandma's wealth, divided equally among all remaining heirs. No more games, no more secrets. Safe, clean, final. Option 2, continue. Face one final challenge that could uncover the deepest, darkest truth buried in this family, but only one heir will receive the full inheritance. And the others? They will be left with nothing. A deadline was included: sunset the following day. The family erupted. Richard immediately demanded they end the game. Take the money. Cut our losses. We've been humiliated enough. Margaret agreed, citing Elias's presence as proof the game was rigged. But Olivia stood her ground. You're all terrified because she finally forced us to see ourselves, she said. But this isn't about money. It never was. It's about what we did, what we buried. Elias said nothing, only watching. As the hours passed, a slow burning fear settled into the house. If they chose the second option, there would be one final trial, but it would come at the cost of trust and possibly family itself. Some whispered that the choice itself was the challenge. See who valued truth over comfort, legacy over money. That afternoon, Elias pulled Olivia aside and showed her the final passage from Grandma's ciphered journal, one he had kept hidden until now. There is a secret none of them know, a choice I made that condemned someone innocent. The challenge is not to earn forgiveness, it is to offer it, even when it is undeserved. The words hit Olivia like a punch to the chest. Somewhere in their family's past, Grandma had made a devastating mistake, and she wanted someone to be brave enough to undo it. At sunset, the family assembled in the garden, where a table had been set up with two boxes, one marked truth, the other fortune. Grandma's voice played over a hidden speaker, calm but solemn. If you open the box marked fortune, the game ends. The inheritance will be divided, and your journey with me concludes. If you open the box marked truth, the final challenge begins, and only the one willing to sacrifice everything will claim the legacy. A moment of stillness. Then, Olivia stepped forward and opened the box marked truth. Inside was a single envelope. She read aloud. There is still a lie this family clings to. One innocent person has carried the blame for decades. Your final task is to reveal the truth, and in doing so, sacrifice your own claim to the fortune. Will you give up everything to set the record straight? It was devastating. The room went silent. All eyes turned to Penelope, who had grown pale, her breathing ragged. Slowly, shakily, she stepped forward. I blame Daniel, she whispered. I told my father he stole from Grandma. But it was me. I was the one who moved the money. I was angry at her for loving him. I ruined her. And she protected me. Everyone stared. The truth, finally laid bare, was a bombshell. Grandma had vanished to protect Penelope's reputation, allowing herself to be disowned, while the real betrayal had come from her own daughter. The speaker crackled again with Grandma's voice. To the one who uncovers the truth, I give nothing but my deepest thanks, because love, real love, asks for no reward. It only asks for courage. The final inheritance, every cent, every asset, every letter, was to go to Elias. And Olivia? She had sacrificed everything. She walked away with nothing in her hands, but peace in her eyes. The rest of the family stood in silence as the garden lights dimmed, and the truth, finally, found air to breathe. The storm had passed, but not everyone made it through unscathed. After Olivia's selfless choice and Penelope's public confession, the family found themselves scattered, emotionally shattered, quietly reflective, or bitter and unyielding. The garden, once the backdrop of Grandma's most painful secrets, now stood in eerie silence. The game was over. The truth was out. And Elias? He had won. The fortune, by every legal and emotional measure, belonged to him now. The amended will was airtight, the final task completed, and Grandma's instructions followed to the letter. Yet as he walked through the now empty greenhouse, his mother's sanctuary, he felt none of the triumph he'd imagined, only quiet grief. That's when he found the final envelope, taped beneath the desk drawer, sealed with red wax and marked with his name, Elias for after. Inside, in Grandma's unmistakable script, were only 4 words. You were never alone. Confused, Elias reached into the envelope again and discovered a second key, this one smaller, tarnished with age. It fit the lockbox buried behind a false panel in Grandma's closet, one no one else had found. Inside the box? A videotape. They gathered in the den. Elias, Olivia, Marcus, Margaret, Penelope, even Richard, and watched together. What they saw would alter the fabric of their family forever. The screen flickered to life. Grandma, sitting in a chair beneath the great magnolia tree in her backyard, looked older and thinner than they remembered, but her voice was strong, her eyes sharp. If you're watching this, then the game is over, and so is my time with you. But before you go on, there's one last thing you need to know, something I've never said. Elias is not just my son, he's your brother, all of you. I had him before I married your grandfather. I gave him up to protect the family name. No one ever knew. Not even my husband. The silence in the room was absolute. I spent years watching you all forget who you were, who we were. I don't blame you, we're shaped by our pain. But pain, when left to fester, becomes cruelty. That's what happened to this family. I didn't create the challenge to punish you. I created it to rebuild you. To show you who had the heart to lead, who could still choose love, even when it cost them everything. And Olivia, my sweet girl, that was always going to be you. The camera zoomed slightly, capturing the emotion in her eyes. Elias inherits the money, yes. But you, Olivia, inherit something far greater. My legacy, my journals, my name, and the truth that will set this family free. Elias, stunned, looked over at Olivia, his half-sister, who sat pale and tearful, clutching the letter she had once read aloud. What she had thought was the end had only been a turning point. Grandma had known all along what she would choose. The final twist? The fortune Elias received had a stipulation. It could not be spent until he and Olivia together decided how to use it. It wasn't a reward. It was a responsibility, one that demanded unity, not division. Suddenly, the siblings saw each other not as rivals, but as pieces of the same broken story trying to rebuild something whole. The remaining family members filtered out slowly, each lost in thought. Some would walk away unchanged. Others, like Marcus and Margaret, would begin to mend. Penelope, shamed but strangely relieved, confessed to seeking therapy. Even Richard, whose pride had always outweighed his wisdom, stood in the hallway a little longer than usual, eyes fixed on a family photo. And Olivia? She returned to the greenhouse the next morning, a fresh journal in hand. She began writing, not as a competitor or a survivor, but as the next matriarch in a lineage of broken hearts learning to heal. Because in the end, Grandma's inheritance wasn't money or land or antiques. It was clarity. It was courage. It was the kind of love that demands truth and dares to forgive.